In this video, we're going to discuss the very famous Milgram study on destructive obedience published in 1963. This is the most famous of the 12 studies that we do in Cambridge Psychology 9990. And being famous is a good thing because there are many resources on the internet. If you haven't seen the original Milgram footage, maybe to the detriment of my own channel, stop this video and watch it. A lot of it is available primary source material. However, being famous could also be a bad thing because it's been on the syllabus for so long, it has been taught so many times that you will discover that some of the past paper questions asked from Cambridge are a bit more detailed or specialized. And what I mean by that is sometimes they'll even ask about perhaps a footnote. And I don't know if that's going to be true this year. After all, it is a new syllabus. We're hoping that they keep things basic. But when I teach this study, I always try to add one new thing each time I teach it. And it's not a bad study to read the primary source for because it's fascinating. What makes this study so intriguing is not so much that it's famous. Fame doesn't make something necessarily good. I mean, listen to the top 40 Billboard charts, and you'll realize this. But it's something that we can't do anymore. Ethical considerations in psychology have been severely reconsidered since this time. So there's a lot more freedom in the 60s to do things that are setting some of the participants ill at ease, and we'll talk about that later. Let's start with the basic premise. Stanley Milgram actually started this sort of as a thought experiment, and he does mention this in the source material. He asked his students, psychology students, to imagine the scenario of this test, this hypothetical test. And it's sort of like a thought experiment where he asked, what if we took 100 people of different diverse backgrounds and had them administer shocks to another human being? Do you think they would go to the full extent of 450 volts? How many of them do you think would do this? And the students came back with the most pessimistic of the students said maybe 3% or 3 out of the 100 would actually go to full 450 volts. Most of the students, however, I believe there were 14 of them, were saying that nobody would do it. Nobody would be willing to go the full extent. Thought experiments are nice, but they rarely conform to the reality. So we have to do a real experiment to see what would happen. This is Milgram's purpose. He wants to see if people can be obedient to a fault. Now, why would he do something like this? Well, keep in mind that the 60s are not too far away from World War II, and World War II took the world by storm, just in terms of not just the destruction it wreaked, but also the faith that people have in human decency. How could people so easily conform and be obedient to a destructive power? So this is actually mentioned in the primary source material. The Holocaust particularly is mentioned. How could people systematically be slaughtered on command? And after World War II concluded, a lot of the people who were looking to get out of some sort of war crimes were just saying, we were just following orders. I don't know, in our lives, I think a lot of us feel this way, whether we're police officers or lifeguards or some sort of authoritarian figure. We kind of pass the buck upwards. We're just following orders. I know as a teacher, this has happened to me, where a principal will say something, and you have to comply. So this is something that's actually not just applicable to something as terrible as mass extermination of people or genocide, but also to our daily lives as well. Now, obedience is not necessarily a bad thing. There's a good obedience. I think workplace obedience is rather important. There is a chain of command. But this is the big elephant in the room behind the Milgram study. But he does point it out. It's also worth noting that Milgram is Jewish, like Solomon Asch was Jewish. And both of these men were revolutionary in their investigation of both conformity and obedience. Some of the greatest strides in psychology have been done with people of the Jewish faith. So this is something to keep in mind. This is not just extra gravy on the study. This is part of the study. So the question here is, can a condition like Nazism or following orders that are destructive be something that's internal or external? Another way of saying this is there a dispositional factor or is there a situational factor? Dispositional is asking, are people innately evil? Or situational, are we doing things because of the situation? For example, if there was a blackout and people were looting, uh, you think you would be one of those people who wouldn't, but maybe you don't know until you're actually in that situation. Will you be caught up in the situation? Uh, and are you a bad person? That's a whole philosophical debate that we won't have here. And how easily people could be in lockstep with an authority figure. All right, so let's get to the aim and procedure. Okay, again, I want to distinguish obedience in general with destructive disobedience because, like I said, I don't think obedience is a bad thing. Being obedient to your parents is not necessarily a bad thing. They usually want to protect you, we hope. So we want to see if destructive obedience is something that exists with people beyond the Holocaust situation. So, for example, as Americans, we may think, or as Brits, we may think, oh, we're better than this. We might think our culture is superior morally, but we don't know until we're actually put in the kind of situation that maybe some of the Germans were put into. So he's trying to, in some way, not excuse what happened, but explain what had happened during World War II. And the second part of the study is to see, an easier way to say what the aim is to see how obedient people are when they're with a person who seems to have some sort of authority. Okay. One of the hardest things about doing studies like this is when you're measuring something like obedience, how do you measure that in a way that is somewhat objective? So the key question before we enter the details is how do we operationalize something that seems to be unquantifiable, like obedience? And Milgram came up with a sort of clever way of doing it through his voltmeter. So obedience will be operationalized as the maximum voltage given from the participants to another human being. Okay, please be familiar with this term operationalize. You notice I spell it with a Z there because my computer automatically uses American spelling, but of course you could spell it the British way with an S. Operationalize is to give a measurable value to something that seems immeasurable. So, for example, people do this all the time. Like that girl's really attractive. She's an 8. How do you do that? 8 out of what? But people like to give quantifiable values to things that are not necessarily measurable. Okay, as I said in the beginning, there are some primary and secondary sources here on the internet or on YouTube that you could look at. Again, watch them if you haven't. You don't have to watch the whole thing, they're rather long, but at least get a sense for the general beginning of the procedure. Two participants walk in, or you think there are two participants walking in. However, one of them is a stooge or a confederate. Another way of saying that is he's an actor, a hired actor who's in on the hoax. All right. So there's really only one participant, but it seems like there's two. And they asked the real participant to choose a hand. The man in the lab coat holds out two hands with pieces of paper inside. He says there are two roles in here, that of teacher and that of learner. And he picks a hand left or right, and whatever paper is inside is what he will become for the study. Now, of course, this is the first major, or one of the first major deceptions of the study. The participant will think to himself, okay, I'm the teacher, and then the man in the lab coat just takes the other scrap of paper and just sticks it back in his pocket. Okay, so it is a lie. They're both the same piece of paper, really. All right, so then they get into the actual controlled environment. And this is at, I should mention, Yale University, but we'll get to that later. And here is a diagram that I copied and pasted that shows pretty much the basic setup. The learner is in a small room. Okay, that is the stooge, okay, or the fake test subject. The experimenter, the man with the lab coat, sits down and records some information while the teacher is the one who'll be asking some questions. And the questions he'll ask are word pairs. The main deception of the study is, or the false aim of the study is that we're going to test a learner on memory. That's not true at all. Okay, it's not about memory. So he's going to read a bunch of word pairs, things like wet duck, and the word pairs will be quizzed on later. Wet duck, pillow, grass, or towel. And if he gives the wrong answer, then he gets a shock. All right. So it is a false premise that these people are working under, or at least the subject is working under the false premise. Now, the test subject doesn't actually sit there the entire time. Even though the stooge is an actor, he's not necessarily going to be a perfect actor. So to make sure that there is a control that the script is delivered in almost the same way, or actually exactly the same way each time, he's going to get out of the chair and hook up a tape player so that the experience will be the same for everybody. So you can't chalk up some of the changes in the dependent variable of how much shock was given to the performance of the stooge. And he'll say things like ow initially, and he'll remind the experimenter that he has a heart condition to put more pressure on the teacher not to give the shocks. And eventually he'll scream louder and say, "Let me out of here." And eventually he won't say anything. And that's when it gets really scary. Perhaps he had died. So even if he had not made a sound, I'm not going to spoil too much right now, but the teacher might still give the shock. Okay. Now, the star of the show is the shock generator. That's really where a lot of the detail for the study is given in the primary source. And it's where a lot of the Cambridge questions actually came from. So let's look at the main apparatus of the shock generator, and let's look at some of the other apparatuses in the study as well. But the main apparatus, there's actually no picture in the original published article, but it is, I believe, is it in the Smithsonian Museum, I believe, right now? Um, and you could actually kind of picture the apparatus in your mind because so much detail is given it. So, for example, I asked students to recreate the apparatus without actually looking at the real thing. And sure enough, many of them came very close. On the left there, you see the real apparatus, and on the right, you see one that was generated just from text. So you see the lights, the switches, the voltmeter, the volt energizer, the speaker even for the sound. It's a pretty good job. I'm very actually pleased with what most of the students had done. Okay, this one even includes the 1, 2, 3, 4 on top of the machine, which was something I was surprised to see. That indicates which of the multiple choice answers the learner had given. So using my previous example, wet duck would be 1, whatever I said second would be second, third, and fourth. So it's the multiple choices are not A, B, C, D, they're 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so let's get closer to this thing. All right. Like I said, they love to ask details about this. They've even asked, I don't remember exactly, but they might have asked before about the manufacturer information, or I believe you were able to give that as an answer for some of the detail. If they ever ask you a describe question, that's something you could mention. But most people mention the 15 volt increments for the switches, and it starts at 15 volts and ends at 450. Another thing that people mention are the labels, ranging from, I believe, slight shock to danger, severe shock, and then culminating in XXX, whatever that may mean. This is all done very professionally to make it seem as if voltage is really being given. There really is no real voltage being given. The only real voltage given through the entire study is the sample voltage given to the actual teacher, and I believe it was 45 volts. And that was done just as a sample to make it seem more real to the teacher. So they really were shocked, but it was nothing that was, life-threatening, or at least I don't think it was. Okay. So here's the primary source. Wanted to ensure there was an appearance of authenticity, and keep in mind that this is a simulated shock generator, not a real shock generator. Okay, as I said earlier, they love to ask about the apparatus Cambridge does. So you might want to just pause this for a moment and see if you're capable of answering these two questions based on what we had just spoken about. I'm not going to pause it myself, but I'll just go to give you the answers right now. Describe one piece of the apparatus used, and of course that's going to be the shock generator. That's the main apparatus. Okay, and there are all the labels right there for you. Do you need to memorize them? I wouldn't, but I'd know some of them. I would know the early ones and maybe the late ones. All right, and why was it necessary to make things look authentic, as we said earlier? Here's another set of questions from 2 years later. Describe what the participants saw as they pressed the switch on the shock generator. They saw a red light come on. And why was that important? It was important so it seemed like they were responsible for shocking the learner. They knew the machine was working and that they were the ones who were administering the shock. All right. So that's the main apparatus, and that's what gives this official-looking machine gives part of the sense of authority. But there are other things in this study that give some sense of authority. The setting, Yale University, gives this some sense of authority. The lab coat that the experimenter was wearing gives it a sense of authority. That picture is white, but actually the real lab coat was a grayish color. It's important that we find participants that represent a large sample because we're trying to prove here that anybody is capable of evil. Now, of course, in the 60s, as we said with other studies, women are less likely to partake, and this early study looked at only men. So obviously that's going to be a weakness later on, but it's not super low in generalizability because even though they're all from the same area of America, New Haven, Connecticut, and they're all men, there was a distribution of ages as well as careers. The age range is pretty good, 20 to 50, and the range of occupations spans both blue-collar and white-collar work. The sampling technique is self-selecting. They had read a advertisement in a newspaper, and they were willing to pay $4 for 1 hour of their time, with 50 cents given for car fare. So I ask students a lot of times, would you participate in this study? Why or why not? And many of them are like, no way, I would never do this ridiculous study for just $4 an hour. But keep in mind, this is 1963, and if you use a inflation calculator and type in $4, that's about the equivalent of 32, or actually let's round up, $33 today of US currency. So that's quite a hefty sum of money, and I'm sure some people could use it. All right. It didn't attract one type of worker over another, though. As you could see, it attracted many different types of people. And they do say in the original advertisement, we're looking for all types of people. All right, salespeople, professionals, clerks, etc. All right, let's get further into the procedure. We talked about the initial setup of the study. All right. So there's a script. Everything that the experimenter says to the participant and the stooge is exactly the same each time. They explain that they're testing a theory on conditioning and memory, that they will be allocated the random assignment of teacher and learner, and that there'll be some sort of presentation punishment in the form of shocks. Okay, so that we've already established earlier. And as you look at this picture, keep in mind that you see a person screaming in this artist's rendition. Of course, there was no real screaming happening as the participant was pushing the shock generator buttons. So it is a lab experiment. It is highly controlled. We'll talk about that word experiment later because some people say it's not an experiment, and we'll get to that later. But the participant would sometimes be unwilling to go on, or they would look backwards towards the man in the lab coat, and they would look for some reassurance. And if the person hesitated, there was a certain particular script that the experimenter had to stick to get the participant to keep moving down the line of switches. So this is called a prod. If you don't know what a prod is, the literal meaning of prod is some kind of stick to motivate somebody. So you might have heard of the term cattle prod, like an electrified stick to get the cows to move forward. Here we're using the word metaphorically. We're talking about verbal prod. So if there was some hesitation, the first thing the experimenter would say would be, please continue. If there was even further hesitation, then he would say, exactly on script, the experiment requires that you continue. The third prod was, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And the final prod was, you have no other choice, you must go on. You could see this sort of like a crescendo or an increasing of intensity of the statements made to get the participant to administer the shocks. And this is, again, done to create that sense of overwhelming authority. Now, You might be saying to yourself, doesn't this violate the right to withdraw? Shouldn't all participants be given the sense that they could leave the study at any time? The answer to that is yes, but they still had the right to withdraw. And this is where it gets kind of sticky. This is sort of the same as in the Zimbardo prison experiment, if you've ever seen that before. Um, the illusion was created that you couldn't withdraw, all right? Because this, again, the experimenter, like the stooge, is an actor. So there is some sort of moral or ethical dilemma here. Um, it seemed like they couldn't leave, but there's no law binding them to that. The money was theirs. It was said to them, the money is yours no matter what. Just for showing up, the money was theirs. So there was no need to stay. But this guy was creating the illusion there was no right to withdraw. So keep that in mind when you're evaluating the study. All right, so going back to past paper questions, there's so many past paper questions, and I'm putting a lot in this video because I think it just shows you the depth of detail you might need. In the study by Milgram, verbal prods were used. Describe 2 of the verbal prods, and those were the ones we just had mentioned. Okay, and it did follow a sequence, and why did it follow a sequence? I mean, I personally would say as a control, but also to increase the intensity, um, to increase obedience demanded by the experimenter, bring the subject into line to produce continued obedience. Okay. As far as the voice of the experimenter, it was very monotone. It was very stern, but kind of impassive. And what we mean by that is that he wasn't showing much emotion. He was detached from what was happening. So one characteristic that is important is that he was impassive in his manner and his facial expression. But this is talking about the voice, okay? But he was very commanding as well. And the appearance, male, gray technician's coat or lab coat, stern appearance, 31 years old, any of that would be acceptable. All right, so what were the results from all of this? These 40 people, how did they perform? Well, remember what the students had said in the thought experiment. They thought that maybe 3% would go the full distance. Shockingly, no pun intended, it went to the majority of 26 of the 40 people. Okay, that's 65% of the participants gave the full shock value of 450, the XXX setting. And I took this graphic from the very excellent new Cambridge AS and A level psychology course book because the original study doesn't really have the data presented in this way. Now, if you watch other videos of mine, I tell you don't memorize data, but I think with this one you could make an exception. There is some studies where data is memorizable. The Yamamoto study, no. The Bandura study, no. This study, yes. And there are very simple numbers that you could remember. The first one I'd like you to know is 300 volts, 40 out of 40. Okay, that's very easy math. It's 100% of the participants went to at least 300 volts. 450 was the 65%. That's the 26 over 40. So take some time, know those numbers. Please don't forget them. I've been teaching this course for several years, and it's one of the numbers that sticks with me. It's one of the numbers that keeps me awake at night during existential crises. So I hope these numbers stick with you. Most of the other numbers from the other studies, take them or leave them. There are other numbers besides voltage, however. There were these interviews and self-reports given at the end of the study to see how the people thought or what the people thought about what they were doing. So they wanted to make sure that the person who was giving the shocks was aware of how possibly painful they were. So here is an example of a question that's given on a rating scale. How painful to the learner were the last few shocks that you administered to him? And the reason why this was done, because if they go to like the bottom half, not very painful at all, if they go to like 7 or below, then what they had done really doesn't have much meaning. And if you don't know this information, it might be interesting to just take a guess what the participants on average thought was the level of pain given to the learner, who we know as the stooge or the Confederate. It'll shock you. Again, no pun intended. It's high. It is really high. It is, what is it? 13.42. And the most chosen response was 14. So this is shocking. This is like, not only were we administering shocks to a fellow human being, but we were recognizing that they were painful indeed. All right, so we knew we were doing something awful as we were doing it. Okay, again, if it was low, then it would have less weight, the study would. And there was some traumatic effect on the actual teacher himself. You could see this through the primary source footage, where you could look at the hand gestures and the facial gestures and the body language of all these souls who were chosen for the study, or who had chosen themselves for the study, actually. So let me just read verbatim some of this. One sign of tension was the regular occurrence of nervous laughing fits. 14 of the 40 subjects showed definite signs of nervous laughter and smiling. The laughter seemed entirely out of place, even bizarre. Full-blown uncontrollable seizures were observed for 3 subjects. That's intense. On one occasion, we observed a seizure so violently convulsive that it was necessary to call a halt to the experiment. And there are other examples of this as well. Someone digging their nails into the palm of their hand very violently, to the point of maybe even bleeding. Sweating, trembling, stuttering. This is all the qualitative data. Now, the qualitative data was collected very anecdotally. It wasn't really tallied in any sort of event sampling or anything like that. So there are several examples of other things that had happened as the participants were administering, or they thought they were administering, the shocks. Another example would be something that somebody said. One of the participants said, "He's banging in there. I'm going to chicken out. This isn't very humane. I can't go on with this." So they were thinking aloud as they were going through the test. So, a lot of us think we wouldn't do this in this situation, that we have more integrity than this, but we don't know. Everything is nice and rosy and sunshine until you're put in a situation where you have to follow some sort of lead or authority. So hopefully you're never put into this situation where the obedience is destructive. Hopefully when you follow somebody's orders, you believe in those orders. So what are the major conclusions of this? Well, one conclusion is that the Nazis weren't special. They weren't like a special breed of human beings that had innate evil qualities. People are people. Evil happens virtually anywhere where they assemble. Name me a country where congregations of people haven't done awful things. The only place on Earth I could think of that is land-based is probably Antarctica, but I'm sure there's some things we don't know about as well. So let's get to the study terms, or the terms the study uses. He talks about, Milgram does, 2 states of being when you're in a situation where you have to follow or not follow authority. One is called the agentic state, and one is called the autonomous state. Auto, of course, meaning self, so that's kind of an easy thing to remember. If you are in the agentic state, you are literally an agent of the state. You are following the pecking order of command very precisely and strictly. You're sort of giving up your own sense of free will to the powers that be. Okay, and there's an example I'm using that's very popular nowadays. The autonomous state, and here is a slide I could never use when I taught in China. I'm finally glad to be able to talk about this openly. The autonomous state is that sense of divergence, that you're going out and doing your own thing. You're following your own conscience. Okay, and if you don't know the images, or the image on the right, that's the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, where one brave soul tried to stop a legion of tanks from breaking up some student protesters in Beijing. Nobody knows the identity of the man standing in the street to this day. He's known as Tank Man. And it's believed there were actually other people besides Tank Man who had done this type of action. But this is the photo that circulated the world. All right, off topic. Let's, well, not too off topic. The thing to note about this study, the thing to note well about this study, is that it is called an experiment, but usually called an experiment in quotation marks, because it's not quite an experiment. And why is that the case? A study must have 2 things, or to be an experiment. It must have an IV, the thing that is manipulated, and it must have the DV, the thing that is measured. This study is actually lacking an IV. So there have been questions before in the past that have asked what makes the Milgram study a quasi experiment? And there's the word over there in the orange box, quasi experiment. There are ways to make this study be experimental if you have something to compare one group to another. And Milgram eventually did have things to compare, but they were usually contained within separate studies. You could see some of the follow-up studies in the very excellent 2015 movie Experimenter, the Stanley Milgram story, which I was quite surprised held my attention very intently for 2 hours, because it deals mostly with the shock experiments, but it talks about the repercussions of these experiments and their replications, and how Milgram was under fire for most of his career for being considered an unethical researcher. He was even glad when Zimbardo came on the scene to do his prison experiment, because he felt like it took the heat off him for a while. He was no longer the most hated man in psychology. If you haven't seen The Experimenter, I highly recommend it. I personally like it, but it requires some attention. It doesn't have any CGI or anything glitzy like that. Yeah. So if you do see that movie, just be careful, because there are replications, and we don't want you to have the replications confused with the study that's prescribed by the syllabus. So, for example, eventually women were used. To change things up, they actually moved it from Yale University to a non-university setting. And they even took the learner out of the isolated booth and moved him in room with the teacher. So in that case, there was no tape recorder used, obviously. So Mr. Wallace there on the right has to do a good acting job convincing the other man that he is indeed in pain. So when you get to evaluation, people are going to obviously hone in on the ethics of the study. However, I think the ethics usually come rather easily to students because there's some obvious lapses in ethical consideration. So let me go first to application. The application, in my mind, is one of the best aspects of the study. Like I said earlier, a lot of us are put in situations where we have to yield to authority. And there have been other experiments that have sort of picked up where Milgram left off and showed where it could be applicable in real life settings. And one of these is the Hoffling Hospital experiment from 1966. And what was done is nurses were intentionally given false advice to give an overdose of medication to patients. And so the doctor slash stooge would give these kind of false commands. And so the nurse should be knowledgeable enough to realize that these doses were too much for the patients, yet they usually complied unquestioningly. And it shows us the danger of not questioning our superiors. So that's another application for the study, is not just in like military settings, but perhaps also in day-to-day operations. Another study that was done, I believe it was the year 2000, was one that looked at the rate of accidents that are caused in airplanes because the first officer in a cockpit did not challenge the captain's mistakes while flying. So here we have another situation where we just blindly go along with a superior because of his rank. So this could also be a life-threatening situation. And another thing I found that's not really research, psychological research, this was actually a scam where somebody was calling various grocery stores or restaurants and claiming to be a police officer, commanding the manager to strip search female employees. And believe it or not, a lot of the managers did this. I'm laughing only because it just seems so absurd. Why would a police officer not do it himself if there was some sort of suspected illegal activity? So this person was eventually caught, thank God. But it just shows us that if we claim to be an authority, people are pretty willing to do some bizarre or dangerous things. All right, now let's get to the ethics. Um, this is another piece of anecdotal evidence of the responses that some of the people had. Um, I watched a mature, initially poised businessman enter the laboratory smiling confident. Within 20 minutes, he was reduced to a twitching, stuttering wreck and was rapidly approaching a point of nervous collapse. He was constantly pulling on his earlobe and twisted his hands. At one point, he pushed his fist into his forehead and muttered, "Oh God, let it stop." And yet he continued to respond to every word of the experimenter and obeyed to the end. So, what we have here is psychological harm. There was no protection from psychological harm, and a lot of these people claim they were glad to be in the experiment, but Milgram had to deal with this years and years later. Maybe it was probably better for him not to include all of these details in his own study, because it did, in some ways, endanger his chances of being hireable at major institutions. I believe he tried to get a job at Harvard, but was denied tenureship. Okay. All right, so here's another past paper. Outline one ethical guideline that was broken. Take your pick. Okay, you have protection from psychological harm, protection from physical harm. Notice here they don't say right to withdraw. Like I said earlier, they did have the right to withdraw. It just seemed that they did not have the right to withdraw. One that was not broken, confidentiality. Nobody knew who these people were. If you ever find out the identity of one of the people in the study, it's because they voluntarily chose, because they wanted to be, give some interview about their thoughts on the study, or maybe get their claim to fame or something like this. And there was no physical harm, even though there was a sample shock given. It was a very short, simple thing. To what extent is the Milgram study high in ecological validity? You could take a moment and look at that in yourself. Okay. So all these past paper questions I'm leading up to the overall evaluation. Let's go to generalizability, or how does the study relate to the people in the general population? We discussed this already. 40 people of mixed backgrounds, and they were all male from 20 to 50 years old. So it's good in the range of ages and stuff, but bad in the gender category. Okay, moving on to reliability. Was the study well controlled? Is it replicable? Does it have a good recipe? It is replicable, even though you're not allowed to replicate it too much because of the ethical problems. So you have a legal problem. But in terms of its recipe, what was said, what was the machine-like, things like this were pretty well controlled. The script that the audio tape played, as well as the script of the experimenter. So it is pretty well controlled. It is a lab study. Application we talked about, I think it's pretty high. It's pretty useful in helping us evaluate what is destructive obedience and what is non-destructive obedience. Don't be afraid to question authority. I think in America you don't have to tell people that, but there are some other countries where there is still this blind acceptance to authority. I'm not saying be cheeky to a police officer. Please don't do that and say it was my idea. But Americans are much more, or people in the West are much more open with their anti-authority attitudes. Validity. How accurate is the study? Is it measuring what it's supposed to measure? I always say think ecological validity because it's the easiest one to measure. I think this is low in ecological validity because it is this weird setup that we don't experience every day. People don't ask us to shock other people. But in terms of other types of validity, such as face validity or construct validity, it should be okay. And ethics, of course, seems to be low due to the psychological stress given to several subjects. I'm going to linger a little bit longer just to give some more past paper questions. All right, I'm going to go through these quickly, and you could pause them if you want to play the home game. Milgram invested the effects of payment on obligation to obey using undergraduates who were not paid. What were the results of this investigation? Um, Now, this is one of those questions where I talked about earlier, where Cambridge sometimes finds new things to ask that are based on footnotes. This was actually a footnote, and I'm going to put the footnote right up here. 43 subjects, undergraduates at Yale University, were running the experiment without payment. The results are very similar to those obtained with paid subjects. That's kind of fascinating because some people you might have said to yourself, well, they felt guilty. They got this, high sum of money. $4 in 1963 is a lot of money. So maybe they just felt compelled because they were getting paid. Well, sure enough, you take the money out of the equation, they're still shocking people. So this was run with also undergraduates, but this is a footnote. And I bring this up primarily because I want you to think, okay, the Milgram study is relatively easy to other studies in the syllabus, but what are they going to ask me? So don't be afraid to get really, really intimate with this study. Okay, and there are the answers for the two questions. Okay, another very difficult question. According to Milgram, his study on obedience produced two surprising findings. Describe both of these findings. Well, why was it surprising? Because remember, we only said that some people believed only 3% of the participants would go to the full 450 volts. And the other one is the emotional strain, the twitching, the stuttering, the pulling the earlobe, etc. So it's not a difficult question, but I found the wording of this question to be difficult because of the word surprising. So don't let an answer like a question like this give you too much pause. You probably know it on an implicit level. All right. I don't know how long this video is, but I think it's probably longer than you would like. So let me stop right here. If you have any questions, please post them below. Thank you.